Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. We're back at our afternoon sessions of where do we go from here, revisiting Black Irish relations and responding to a transnational moment. You think at this stage, I know that off the top of my head. I'm Dr. Miriam Nyhan, and it's my pleasure with my colleague, Dr. Kim DaCosta, to welcome you back. This session is going to be really interesting. Two really fine scholars. We're really excited to pair them today. I'm going to first introduce our moderator. Jim Barrett was raised in Chicago, the son of a policeman. He is a professor emeritus of history and African American studies at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and a scholar in residence at the Newberry Library in Chicago. He is the author, among other books, of The Irish Way, Becoming American in the Multi-Ethnic City, published by Penguin Books in 2012, and From the Bottom Up and Inside Out, Race, Ethnicity and Identity in Working Class History, that's published by Duke in 2017, and a number of articles on relations between Irish and African Americans and indeed other groups. He's currently working on Chicago, A People's History. It's my great pleasure to introduce Jim Barrett, who will moderate and introduce our speaker this afternoon, Touré Reid. Jim, over to you.
Thank you. I wanted to start by making sure I'm on screen and thank Miriam and Kim. I've been present for most of the sessions and I've really enjoyed the conference a lot. It's a pleasure to reconnect with Touré Reid and to introduce him to those of you who are not already familiar with his work. Touré earned his BA from Hampshire College and his PhD in history from Columbia University. He comes from a family of African-American educators, and his last name may be familiar to those of you who follow connections between the African-American community and the left. Professor Reid's research focuses primarily on the impact of race and class ideologies on African-American civil rights politics and also on public policy in the 20th century. His first book, Not Alms, But Opportunity, The Urban League and the Politics of Racial Uplift, is a critical history of the Urban League, but it's also, I would say, an intellectual history of the uplift ideology in that era. His second book, Toward Freedom, The Case Against Race Reductionism, which was published by Verso in 2020, is an intervention in the debate about identity, politics, and social class, and as such, it bears on his remarks this afternoon. Finally, Touré is co-author of Renewing Black Intellectual History, the Ideological and Material Foundations of Black American Thought. His articles have appeared in the Journal of American Ethnic History, in Labor, Catalyst, Dissent, Jacobin, The Nation, and other publications. Touré is currently working on two projects, one on a study of race and class in the entertainment industry, and the other one tentatively titled New Deal Civil Rights, Class Consciousness and the Quest for Racial Equality. Today, Professor Reid has in mind, I think, juxtaposition of race as fantasy and race as reality. So it's with pleasure that I hand things over to Touré Reid.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Jim. It's good to see you, not in person, but by video. And I want to thank Kimberly and Miriam, who've been incredibly gracious and helpful. And I'm always in need of help and support. So thank you very much for all that you've done. Now, before I get into the talk, and I will confess to all who are present, I'm likely to fumble my way through Zoom because I'm about several months rusty on it. I want to show two very short videos, 30 seconds each. And after the first one, maybe the second, I'll ask a question about that. So let's see if I can share one of them with you. And here it is. So assuming that we all saw that, I'm going to stop the share for a second. Does anyone have any thoughts? What jumped out at you about that Ancestry DNA ad, if anything?
Touré, were we supposed to hear that?
Oh, you didn't hear it?
We didn't hear it.
Oh, no, it's horrible.
I think because of the thingies.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll skip it. I don't need it.
Okay.
We'll just come back to that some other time, some other way. So today I want to talk to you about race, class, ethnicity. And I want to begin by stating something that will at first seem entirely out of left field, but here it is. I noticed recently that the sequel to the movie Black Panther is due out in 2022. This jumped out at me because I'm one of those rare Black Americans who did not actually care for the film Black Panther. If you recall the enthusiasm for the film back in 2018, you can imagine how awkward this must have been for me. Nearly everything I had read or heard about the film was laudatory. For perspective, just a couple of days after the film's release, the New York Times published an article titled, "Why Black Panther is a Defining Moment for Black America." The author, Carvel Wallace, ultimately described the fictional African nation of Wakanda, the homeland of the Black Panther, as the repository of the hopes and dreams of African Americans. As Wallace put it, quote, "Black Panther is a Hollywood movie and Wakanda is a fictional nation, but coming when they do, from a director like Ryan Coogler, they must also function as a place for multiple generations of Black Americans to store some of our most deeply held aspirations." Acclaimed director Ava DuVernay echoed these themes. She said, quote, "Wakanda itself is a dream state, a place that's been in the hearts and minds and spirits of Black people since we were brought here in chains." Again, if you reflect on these statements, which were illustrative of the enthusiasm surrounding the film, you can imagine how difficult it is to be a Black person who was turned off by the film Black Panther. It was kind of like being a Black American in 2008 who was critical of the post-racial candidacy of Barack Obama, and I was that guy too, albeit from the left. I should probably go ahead and tell you why Black Panther rubbed me the wrong way, since oddly enough, it's relevant to the topic of the conference. And before I do, I want to close out something. I'll confess, in general, I don't care for so-called live action superhero films, not just because I've aged my way out of them, but that doesn't help. To my thinking, the genre not only celebrates vigilantism, so among other things, it conjures up reflections on the murders of Trayvon Martin and Ahmaud Arbery, but I think the genre also nurtures fascistic sensibilities, since it insists that a stratum of individuals who, because of their superior abilities or their wealth, should have the power to make decisions for all of us, usually via brutal force, without any democratic input or controls. That said, Black Panther has a number of specific features that really bugged me. First, the fictional land of Wakanda is a kingdom, and no matter the race of the monarchs, I reject the rightness of monarchies, be they in the fictional lands of Wakanda or Zamunda from coming to America, or ancient Egypt. Second, I find it unsettling that the villain in Black Panther was the character Killmonger, who was determined to liberate Blacks around the globe, while the hero, T'Challa, worked with the Central Intelligence Agency to thwart this project. Finally, and this is the point that matters for our purposes today, even before either watching or reading about the film, I was turned off by Black Panther's imagery. Specifically, I was taken aback by Black Panther's vision of Black greatness that blended tribal aesthetics with futuristic. Consider this: Wakanda is a high-tech kingdom whose citizens travel around their nations via maglevs, whose armies possess magnetic force shields. plasma cannons, and anti-gravity vehicles, and whose greatest warriors don nearly invulnerable suits powered by kinetic energy. And yet, despite these marvels, pun intended, the Royal Guard relies on spears as their weapon of choice. I can imagine some will hear this reflection as ethnocentric, but if there were an ancient Britain or Celtic fringe equivalent to Wakanda, would Stanley and Jack Kirby, the two white men who created Black Panther, have depicted, let's call it Celtcondas, residents covered in woad while throwing spears at their enemies from flying cars? My negative visceral reaction to Black Panther was, interestingly enough, shaped by my own experiences as a Black Gen X man in the United States. Indeed, the imagery of Black Panther teleported me back to a rather unpleasant conversation, one of many rather unpleasant conversations I had with my biology lab partner, a young man named Sean O'Sullivan, my freshman year of high school. Before I continue, I should tell you I have changed my former lab partner's name to O'Sullivan. However, I assure you that he had a similarly unambiguous Irish surname, which also began with the Gaelic O. As you might expect of a young man named Sean O'Sullivan, Sean was a proud Irish American. So one day I foolishly mentioned the great Irish potato famine to him. I told Sean something to the effect that in the mid-1800s, a fungus devastated Ireland's potato crop, resulting in massive starvation and ultimately a wave of immigration from Ireland to, among other destinations, the United States. At the conclusion of my statement, a look of utter incredulity and contempt washed over Sean's face. First, he told me I didn't know what I was talking about. Then he told me if that had happened, Irish nationals would have simply eaten something else. That's a quote. Finally, and this will bring me back to Black Panther, Sean told me that I was a racist and in a fit of irony proceeded to level any number of anti-Black racial slurs at me. The most striking, the one I had never actually heard before was, and I quote, so bear with me, "Fuck you, you fucking spear chucker." Side note, if you're familiar with the sitcom Everybody Hates Chris, I always considered Sean O'Sullivan to be my real life Caruso, the differences in white ethnic identities notwithstanding. So this is one reason that Black Panther doesn't conjure visions of Black liberation for me. And again, not just because Black Panther's hero worked with the CIA to thwart Black liberation, but instead it reminds me of Sean O'Sullivan's devaluing me by calling me a fucking spear jugger. Okay, on that perfect transition note, I want to use this anecdote to get to a much larger point about identity and race. To that end, I want you to consider two things. First, Sean's sense of who or what Black Americans are was like Stanley and Jack Kirby, bound to notions of primordial identities. In other words, my former classmate, much like Ancestry DNA today, presumed that within the veins of every Black American courses not just the blood of their ancestors, but their ancestors' experiences, perspectives, and values. Black Americans thus possess, according to this framework, a transgenerational, transnational identity. I intend to expound on the implications of this perspective, not simply for unabashed racists like my former classmate, who was a kid at the time, but also for liberal and progressive discourse on inequality for the rest of my talk. But before I do, I would like to foreshadow where I will go with this with a second final brief reflection on Sean O'Sullivan. Despite the fact that Sean was a proud Irish American, he knew nothing about the Great Irish Potato Famine, or I would wager anything else of substance about Irish or Irish American history. Of course, Sean would not have known anything about either Irish or Irish American history, since this information, he didn't read about it, and this information could only have been encoded in his blood or DNA if Madison Grant, Charles Davenport, Henry Goddard, or Heinrich Himmler were right about what makes human beings tick. And I would submit that what is true of Irish Americans and other so-called white people is also true of those of us who identify as Black or African American. And this gets me to what I want to talk about from this point forward, which again is race, class, and identity politics. About a year ago, I published a piece in Jacobin magazine titled Just La Bombolera and the Pathologies of Racial Authenticity. Garnering more than 100,000 reads within 2 weeks of its publication, this essay is likely the most widely circulated piece I will ever write. And sigh, unfortunately, I'm confident it was widely misunderstood. The piece took off from the controversy surrounding former George Washington University history professor Jessica Krug. My essay offered no special insights into Krug or her motivations. Rather, the piece took Krug's persona and career arc as expressions of the problem of racial essentialism. A white woman who had been passing as Afro-Latina for many years, Krug had established her bona fides as a scholar in some large part through her assumed identity as a woman of color. Specifically, her Afro-Latina identity allegedly conferred to Krug a special insider understanding of Hispanics and/or Blacks that would necessarily elude a non-Black or Hispanic scholar. While I came to realize that far too many people read this essay as a case for recruiting and hiring truly authentic Black and Brown colleagues and coworkers, as the essay's title announced, I actually argue the quest for authentic racial voices, perhaps along with the shrinking pool of tenure-track jobs, is what gave us Just La Bambolera in the first place. And frankly, if white academics were looking for authentic Black voices, then who better than a white person to fulfill that fantasy? After all, it is their fantasy. More importantly, because attachments to racial authenticity treat race as a social construct in name only, I argue here, as I have pretty much every place else, essentialist constructs serve neither people of color nor progressive political projects well. Indeed, any Black person who has been on the receiving end of backhanded compliments like, "You're not really Black," or for that matter, any Black person who has either been the victim of racial profiling or even been called, wait for it, a fucking spear chucker, knows the limitations of claims of racial authenticity, even if most would not describe it as such. Barack Obama's so-called post-racial presidency is a not so distant example of this problematic tendency, as post-racialism traded in often unacknowledged ways in the language of racial authenticity. While predictably, conservatives wasted little time race-baiting the nation's first Black president, liberal pundits and politicians alike celebrated President Obama's kind of underclass-informed Horatio Alger success story. Specifically, liberals like Chris Matthews and Senator John Kerry insisted that Obama could speak frankly to young Black boys and men about the cultural impediments of their progress or to their progress because President Obama knew them firsthand. Before ascending to the US Senate and ultimately the White House, we were told young Barack struggled with anger, questioned the value of education, and experimented with drugs, partly because he, like so many other African-American boys, had been abandoned by his Black father. Obama thus represented what the authentic Black experience had come to mean in the post-Reagan era, which was an underclass trope. Of course, as I've argued elsewhere, the sketch of Obama's life told a very different story than the details. President Obama's parents met in college, not the club. Obama's father abandoned him and his mother to attend graduate school at Harvard, not because he had to do a bid in prison. Obama's grandparents did help raise him, but in a solidly middle-class household or better. And Obama may have struggled with the value of education while smoking reefer, but he did so while attending one of Hawaii's most prestigious prep schools. So he had the benefit of class privilege. Obama was an appealing Black presidential candidate then because, well, partly because he affirmed a fantasy embraced by both Reagan Republicans and Clinton Democrats that presumed a post-racial America had eliminated structural impediments to Black economic mobility. Within this paradigm, the major obstacle to Black progress was Blacks themselves. Obama's attachment to underclass metaphors ultimately made clear that his post-racial presidency was less post-racial than post-racism. In other words, Obama's attachment to underclass metaphors, which ironically helped shore up his claims to racial authenticity with both white and Black voters, made clear that Obama did not deny the relevance of race in American life, but rather he diminished the role of racism. And in contrast to the Clintons, Obama's Blackness via his parentage, as well as his performance of Blackness, his biographical sketch, his marriage to Micheál, his time at Trinity United Church of Christ, his friendship with Beyonce and Jay-Z, and frankly, his swag, all of which announced, again, his authenticity, insulated Obama from criticism from many African Americans who might have objected to the same admonitions from a white politician. As I've argued elsewhere, the combination of the Sanders insurgency and the election of President Trump would lead many liberals and even some conservatives to step away from President Obama's update of colorblindness via his post-racial, or more accurately, post-racism framework. By 2018, not only had racial justice become a major theme in liberal and democratic circles, but reparations have become woven into public debates about racial inequality, informed in no small part by public intellectual Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case for Reparations and his subsequent elaborations on this influential article. The genius of Coates' Case for Reparations, however, is that his moralizing and disposition to substitute metaphor for historical analysis allowed Coates to blur the line between anything reasonably understood as reparations in one column and charity, torts, and both means-tested and targeted programs in the other column. Worse yet, Coates' tendency to essentialize both Black culture and white racism contributed to Coates' misidentification of the root causes of the failings of both New Deal and post-war liberalism, which certainly failed to distribute rewards equally or equitably to Black Americans, leading Coates to critiques of the welfare state that harmonize, albeit with the best of intentions, with the Cato Institute. In the aftermath of the conclusion of the contentious 2020 Democratic primaries, followed shortly thereafter by the brutal murder of George Floyd, liberals, progressives, and again, even some conservatives like David Brooks coalesced around an evangelical call for a racial reckoning. To be sure, the acknowledgement of extant and historical racial inequality is an improvement over the colorblind denialism that dominated discourse on racial inequality from Reagan through Obama. Still, the racial reckoning discourse that abounds today, uncomfortably, I would say, with contemporaneous fears of a fascist takeover of the United States, is unsatisfying because this too often proceeds from essentialist understandings of race that ultimately insist on divorcing racial inequalities from the capitalist processes that engender them. Indeed, ubiquitous metaphors like racism is our original sin or racism is in our DNA treat ideological or cultural attachments as if they can in fact take on a life of their own. And unfortunately, the same can be said of more robust constructs like structural racism, along with the dominant understandings of diversity and even intersectionality, both of which presume the existence of discrete racial group interests owed to shared group identities. More importantly, since 2016, we have witnessed these frameworks deployed against the kind of egalitarian political projects that would benefit poor and working class, disproportionately Black and Brown Americans. Hillary Clinton used the language of structural racism and implicit bias to attack Senator Sanders' calls for banking regulation and tuition-free higher education, while deflecting attention from her complicity in Clinton-era tough-on-crime policies, super predators we all recall, and her husband's contribution to the subprime mortgage crisis, which did indeed impact Blacks disproportionately. In the past year or so, major corporations, including JP Morgan, Uber, and Goldman Sachs, have come to embrace intersectionality and structural racism, leading acclaimed legal scholar and theorist Kimberly Crenshaw to praise corporations for taking the lead on racial justice initiatives. After criticizing Senator Sanders and other white progressives, this was in the summer, I think, of 2020, for their alleged colorblind class politics, Crenshaw went on to say, quote, "You have a moment where every corporation worth its salt is saying something about structural racism and anti-Blackness, and that stuff is even outdistancing what candidates in the Democratic Party are actually saying." But these frameworks are appealing in no small part because they tend to treat racial disparities as if they were owed to primordial identities or attachments, instead of processes in capitalism that once again impact Blacks disproportionately, but not exclusively. Since the Kennedy administration, liberal policymakers and academics have tended to attribute disparities either to race in the form of poor Blacks' cultural pathologies or racism, which we might think of as whites' cultural pathologies. While this approach has paid greater dividends to Blacks than conservatives' penchant for so-called benign neglect, liberal pundits and policymakers have tended to look past, much like their conservative counterparts, the structural economic issues that have both undermined Blacks and contributed to the decades-long decline of the American middle class. Corporate-friendly visions of social justice that insist that representation matters, while identifying the wealth gap as the main barrier to racial progress, ultimately offer poor and working class Blacks little more than vicarious wins, from the election of the nation's first Black neoliberal president to Wakanda forever. Indeed, the class character of racial justice discourse centered on the racial wealth gap is transparent if one considers two matters. First, 78% of the racial wealth gap is between the richest 10% of whites and the richest 10% of Blacks. Second, the top 50% of white wage earners possess 97% of all white wealth. Predictably, the centrality of the racial wealth gap to the dominant reparations discourse has led some policymakers and corporations to propose policies or programs that seek to foster wealth parity by promoting Black entrepreneurship, encouraging homeownership, or growing the ranks of people with mortgages, and of course, diversifying the ranks of corporate and government leaders and professors too. Instead of much needed structural change, the current racial justice discourse lends itself to fairly modest reforms to a system that is less and less capable of distributing its rewards to a growing swath of working people across racial lines. Real wages have been on a 50-year downward slide for the bottom 80 to 90% of American workers, thanks to issues such as automation, deindustrialization, the decline of the union movement, public sector retrenchment, and a depressed minimum wage. At the same time, urban regimes' commitment to grow politics, informed by unfettered corporate mobility, has led municipalities to shift tax burdens from businesses to workers, encouraging cities across the nation to subsidize development projects intended to court upscale residents who can afford the taxes necessary to support urban infrastructures, also known as gentrification. None of this is to deny the realness of racism. Since we are social animals, the fact that race is a social construct means that the social significance of race matters. Racism is real. It unquestionably impacts the lives of people of color, from workplace discrimination to racial profiling, and anti-discrimination policies remain necessary even if such policies alone are insufficient to end Black economic precarity. But the point is, fighting racism in the absence of class-based redistributive policies intended to redress material inequality is not likely to yield meaningful results for more than a minority of African Americans and other people of color. To be blunt, those who insist that Black Panther is a defining moment in Black life, or that Jack Kirby and Stan Lee's vision of Wakanda is the place where African Americans' hearts have been since slavery, must already have decent jobs, health insurance, a reasonable expectation of retirement, and because of their class security, they can only be but so concerned that they will be the victims of either a no-knock warrant or violent crime. They also took very different lessons than I from their experiences with the Sean O'Sullivans with whom they have crossed paths. Sean O'Sullivan's sensibilities about race or about Black people may have evolved since the mid-1980s. He was a kid, as was I, and I certainly hope they have. But tragically, too much of what passes for liberal or even progressive discourse today on race and inequality overlaps with my former lab partner's worst impulses. I'll leave you with this gem from last year. In 2020, the African American History Museum featured a page that classified the following characteristics as white values: objective, rational thinking, that's a quote, cause and effect relationships, another quote, the belief that, quote, hard work is the key to success, plan for future, it's another quote, and, quote, delayed gratification. Think on this for a second. Perhaps the clearest expression of the horrific implications of this kind of essentialist thought is that my teenage lab partner, President Ronald Reagan and Charles Murray, would all co-sign this checklist. And I guess that's why they call it hegemony. I will stop there. So thank you for your indulgence, and I'm done.
Thanks so much, Touré. So we've got, I think one of the things the talk does for us is to bring us back to some basic concepts that have actually been around in the discussions over the past 3 Fridays, but maybe give us an opportunity to pin them down a little bit. The talk gave us race and racism in symbolic and metaphorical terms on the one hand, and on the other hand, race in more materialist terms and its connection to social class. So there's a number of ways to start, and we're still hoping to generate a number of questions around the concepts that Touré's been talking about. But I thought we might start with a couple of questions having to do with definitions of some of these terms, and maybe ask Touré to talk a little bit about them. The one term obviously is race essentialism or race reductionism, you know, what we mean by that term when we use it. And then a second, which is I'm pretty sure is directly related to that, is what Touré sees as a more realistic or useful way of looking at the problems of racism and racial inequality than these largely symbolic understandings, which the paper is critiquing. In other words, what's our alternative to that might get us a little bit further in confronting these issues?
Sure. So I guess I should start with the definitions.
Right.
So I'll go with what race reductionism would refer to. I mean, because I think that was the first question. So, and I'll take a kind of circuitous route on this one. Race reductionism as a construct is something that hit me anyway when reflecting on what class reductionism is. And so I'll have to talk about class reductionism in order to talk about race reductionism. So in late 2015, I and others had observed, beginning then, that there were, at the time, I should stop using the passive voice, that the Sanders campaign found itself in the crosshairs of the ubiquitous charge of class reductionism. And subsequently, I and a number of Black leftists I know had also found ourselves in the crosshairs of the charge of class reductionism. And I had thought up to that point that what a class reductionist was someone who believed that racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, fill in the blank, were secondary or inconsequential to the life chances of human beings. And since I don't think that Bernie Sanders ever, staked out that position, but I don't care about him because, he's not here. I know I never staked out that position. I know that the host of Black academics I know, left academics I know, who have been charged with class reductionists, charged with as class reductionists, had never staked out the position, never believed that racism, let's say, was secondary or inconsequential to the lives of Black people. Then it dawned on me, and in fact, I'll amplify this. I mean, I have made, I thought, pretty clear arguments, let's say, against colorblindness. I mean, my first book actually is a critique of the Chicago School of Sociology's race relations model as adopted by the National Urban League. And among the points that I make in that book is, of course, that the Urban League underestimated, the force of racism on some level. So, so again, I mean, I've written defenses of affirmative action and the like, right? So once I realized that, I certainly and others I know weren't really making the case that racism was secondary or inconsequential to the lives of Black people, but we were being charged as class reductionists, I realized that a class reductionist wasn't quite what I thought it was, again, and I thought that it was someone who believed that racism was secondary or inconsequential to the lives of people of color. But a class reductionist was someone who I would argue insisted that racism existed in the world of human contrivance, that it couldn't take on a life of its own. And that, in other words, that they followed through on what the meaning of the social constructedness of race would be. And from a materialist standpoint, that would be an invention by powerful people to justify the exploitation of populations that were classified as outgroup members. So within that context, then, if that all makes sense, what a race reductionist would be is someone who insists that racism can operate independently of the material world that we all live in, right? And that what race essentialism, as a variation on the same theme, would refer to is the idea that race can, in fact, unlike any other ideology, in contrast to any other ideology, take on a life of its own that operates, again, independently of, in the context of America, independently of American capitalism. And, I mean, you can see a lot of examples of this. I would argue, for what it's worth, that certainly drives Ta-Nehisi Coates' work. But what I have read of Eduardo Bonilla Silva, you see a variation on the same theme. So if one imagines that racial groups, let's say, are bound together by a common interest that transcends time and place, that members of so-called racial groups share perspectives and values and the like, irrespective of where they live on the globe, I mean, that would constitute essentialism. Does that make sense?
Yep, it's great. I think we're starting to collect a couple of questions here, but let me squeeze one more in that might,
Sure.
Again, kind of focus the conversation. So what I was thinking about is a kind of specter haunting your remarks you've brought out more explicitly now, which is how social class factors into all this. And I wondered if you could just take a couple of minutes to share why you think it's impossible to understand the nature of racism in the US, and perhaps to do something about it. Why you think it's essential to pay attention to its relationship to class inequality. What's important about speaking of these problems in that context?
Okay, so I'm going to make sure I understood the question, because I lost you in a kind of Battlestar Galactica from 1978 technological glitch. So I think the question is something to the effect, you're asking me to share why it's impossible to understand the nature of racism without exploring its connection to class?
Yes.
Okay. So, I mean, I guess there are a couple of ways I can handle this, and I'll go this way, and I'll sidestep racism and instead go with racial inequality, if that's okay. I would say that if what one is interested in is redressing racial inequality, then it would be impossible to redress racial inequality without addressing the problems of capitalism. And we can take, let's say, disparities in the inmate population, right? Disparities in mass incarceration, which are real. Blacks are far and away overrepresented among the inmate population. African Americans are about just under 13% of the total population, 12.8% of the total population. Between 35 and 40% of the inmate population, so way overrepresented, no question about that. Whites, I believe, are about 40% of the inmate population, 39, 40% of the inmate population. Hispanics are about 20% of the inmate population. Now, so first, again, there's no denying that Black people are overrepresented among the inmate population. There is, I would say, no denying the fact that there are disparities in sentencing as well. And one can consider the fact that while Blacks and whites use drugs at comparable rates, Blacks are more likely to be incarcerated, or at least it had been the case, for drug offenses than whites, despite, again, comparable usage. And that certainly implies that racism is a factor in incarceration. But there's a tendency, I think, among some to insist, and you can see this in the documentary, The 13th, for example, that you can draw a straight line between slavery, let's say, and mass incarceration. And while I certainly would co-sign the view that the era of mass incarceration begins before Reagan, and I think Elizabeth Hinton and I think Guzmani and Clegg make a similar case, are correct to date the era of mass incarceration to the mid-1960s, to 1965, when President Johnson signs the LEAA into law. To take that back to 1865 requires one gloss over a lot of things. And despite the fact, of course, that the felony exemption clause in the 13th Amendment is certainly a problem, it's not really, relevant in the grand scheme of things to mass incarceration. And what you have when you look at the inmate population, even as Blacks are far and away overrepresented, and I guess to amplify this point, it's very clear that there is a class dimension, there's a class component to what's going on with mass incarceration, just as there was an economic component to what was going on in slavery. But if you think about it, 100% of the antebellum slave population was Black. With regard to the inmate population, Blacks are far and away overrepresented, but 40% is not the majority. And so even though there's clearly an economic dimension that's at play to both, it's a different economic dimension. And what's going on with the inmate population, I would submit, and this is why, again, if one wants to redress racial inequality, one has to think about class, is that we are warehousing, as Marxists would say, the reserve army of labor, right? The surplus population, that the majority of the inmate population is comprised of poor people. Deindustrialization, and this is in keeping with the case that Usmani and Clegg make, and James Foreman Jr. makes this case, as does Marie Gottschalk, deindustrialization, automation, neoliberal retrenchment, all contribute greatly to the high rates of poverty among African Americans, particularly, as some would say, concentrated poverty in central cities, which then translates into high rates of violent crime and property theft, which translates in part to high incarceration rates. Again, the disparity doesn't exactly tell you the mechanism, right? You can look at the disparity and you can say that racism is the factor, at least you can to a degree. But if you look a little more closely, if you consider that it's a disparity, that it's an overrepresentation, not a totality, and then consider what the Black inmates, the white inmates, and Hispanic inmates have in common, and it's generally speaking poverty, then if one wants to redress mass incarceration, it's not enough to train police officers to not be racist, right? It's not enough to bring Robin DiAngelo and functional equivalents out to train police officers and prosecutors and the like about implicit bias. One has to actually take aim at the root causes of poverty and the poverty that does in fact inflict African Americans disproportionately, afflict African Americans disproportionately. So that's an example. I mean, I maybe rambled a little more, but sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay. It definitely has the virtue of bringing it down to a concrete situation. I'm going to see if I can get in a couple of questions. There are a number of these that are pretty much adulation for the talk, but there's a couple of questions here. And in this one, I'm going to need a little help from the audience because the concept that's referred to is not one that I'm familiar with. But the question is Wakanda a rough fantasy parallel to a united 32-county Ireland, New Ireland on a sort of fantasy basis? Let me squeeze in one more just on the assumption that we may or may not be familiar with that concept. A couple of people have referred to the Kenosha verdict. If it's okay, maybe we can hold that in abeyance. Let's see. Someone corrects our terminology for the
potato famine.
Yeah, for the Great Hunger.
I was 14.
That's right.
I
That's
mean,
a good.
And I think Sean O'Sullivan may have been 15, but he looked like he was 25 for what it's worth. But
Yeah, that's a good excuse for almost anything that you were that
exactly.
you were working.
Exactly.
Can I actually ask a question on that, Sean O'Sullivan?
Yeah.
So I'm trying to type here and I figure it's just faster if I say it.
Yeah.
So I wanted to revisit the opening example of the Sean O'Sullivan example, because to get your take on what do you make of the attachments many people have to these ideas about what race is, but also their own ethno-racial identity that are very much detached from the kind of, the deeper economic and structural reasons why we observe the kind of inequality that we do. In other words, and I guess more broadly, why the fantasies of a Wakanda, or the belief that there was some essence about Irishness, or even the example that you might say about something else later, the DNA ad. Like, how do you deal with or explain or make sense of that in your overall argument about race reductionism?
That's a good question. And it's an oddly awkward question, because on some level I can appreciate, by way of friends and family, why people can have what appear to be really innocuous attachments to these kind of essentialist racial or ethnic identities. And I should probably just say, I think that the dividing line between race and ethnicity in this context is more or less non-existent, right? So we can just call it racial identities. But precisely because these attachments, as friends and family members of mine have to these identities, would seem innocuous, it's actually why it's so insidious, right? Because I think most people are attached to the identities not because they want to wear a not so festive armband and goose step around town at some point, right? Most people, aren't really consciously drawing from the worst of Western history when they attach themselves to these, in effect, to some version of eugenics, right? That's practically what this is. They are seeking affirmation and self-knowledge. And I think that that's very clear. And, affirmation and self-knowledge are good things. But the fact that they seek affirmation and self-knowledge by trying to track down strangers through time, who supposedly will tell them who they are, tells us something about how far to the right the political landscape has shifted over the last 30 or 40 years. I was in my 20s, I think, when what I would see as scientific racism made a comeback in the 1990s. And before that, just like the first go around, social Darwinism had come back too by way of rational choice ideology. And I think making the connection between rational choice ideology and the return of rational choice ideology / social Darwinism and the return of scientific racism in the 1990s highlights, I think, the background of what gives us, the attachments. And that is, essentially, this is going to sound like a cliche, neoliberalism, right? Reaganism in the American context anyway, because what happens obviously with the Reagan Revolution is we move away from what are in effect liberal understandings about who we human beings are and attach ourselves more and more to illiberal understandings about who we are as human beings, partly because the Reagan Revolution, among other things, shifts the burden of responsibility for or identifies as the engine of society, not our collective action, not what we do through government, let's say, and the like, but instead our individual actions. And of course, if we've decided that the individual is the star of the show, is the engine of civil society, and that what happens around the individual to shape the individual is much less consequential, then that lends itself to embracing retrenchment, eviscerating the public sector, of course, likewise staking out positions in opposition to unions. And I guess the best way to put this is we move away from a public good oriented approach to governance, and instead, again, take this to something that's more like a kind of laissez-faire capitalism kind of framework. And so I think the attachments to these identities, these kind of hereditary identities, reflect the shift, the conservatism, the growing conservatism in the United States from the 1980s to today, and their hegemonic sway. I mean, I know I blathered a bit, but I guess the reason I said that it was awkward is that it's very hard for people to understand that what ancestry DNA, let's say, is selling and what these attachments are is actually a really reactionary framework, because it takes attention away from what the social inputs are, right, in shaping outcomes. And in so doing, while people, again, understand ancestry DNA and the like as vehicles for self-affirmation and self-knowledge, is they're co-signing a vision of society that ultimately suggests that we're not responsible for each other. Our greatness, our deficiencies, they're all inborn. And so there's no need to fund public higher education, let's say, or to fund public primary or secondary education. Because if you were going to be smart and successful, you were going to be smart and successful no matter what. And so that's where I think it's coming from in essence, and maybe in some instances a bit of desperation. I'm, again, blathered through that, Kim, but was that clear-ish?
It's definitely clear on my end. I don't know that people, because they couldn't hear the particular ad, what the story, the narrative was that was attached to it, but I think they can probably surmise, given what they've seen maybe in other contexts. But I guess I wanted to push you a little bit on that because, there's a, burgeoning field of inquiry that uses genealogy as a sort of historical method that it obviously is not the same thing as what you're describing just now with ancestry, with DNA, which is what Alondra Nelson calls genetic genealogy, where there's some would argue, that sort of history making or attachment or ferreting out connections to people one will never know because they're long gone, could be used in service of a more liberatory, progressive, who knows, political project. And I imagine you have a response to that.
I would, sorry.
No, to that possibility, sure.
Sure. It's at least in this historical moment, it's hard for me to imagine a progressive outcome from that. And this historical, I watch CNN. I don't watch Fox News. I don't watch MSNBC. I don't hate myself enough to watch Fox News. I hate myself in a different way that keeps me from watching MSNBC. So I hate myself just right to watch CNN. And over the years of watching CNN, one of the things that I was really taken aback by is Dr. Sanjay Gupta. And in fact, this jumped out at me when in the Obama years, when there was some talk about appointing Dr. Sanjay Gupta Surgeon General. And one of the things that was really chilling about this for me personally is I was surprised to see, as a regular CNN watcher, the extent to which Dr. Sanjay Gupta was attached to biological determinism. And there were a number of segments during the Obama years in which he seemed to co-sign the idea that criminals were born, let's say, rather than made. And it strikes me that the idea that criminals are born rather than made, today, which has been pretty commonplace, I would say, by the 1990s, if not 80s, but by the 1990s, it seemed to be somewhat hegemonic, either by way of genetics or Daniel Patrick Moynihan's kind of epigenetic take on it by way of speciation, which is essentially what I think Hillary Clinton and her husband were getting at with the super predators too. But that what that notion does, as I alluded to in a rather circuitous and awkward way, is it allows us to look past the fact that, let's say, there's a clear correlation between unemployment and poverty, and we tend to talk about poverty rather than unemployment. I think that's a problem, but that there's a clear correlation between unemployment and poverty, and of course, poverty and crime. And if we decide, as apparently Dr. Sanjay Gupta was somewhat comfortable with, that criminals are born rather than made, there's no progressive outcomes there, right? I mean, because and we all we have to do, we don't have to set the Wayback Machine dial to 1890 or 1920. All we have to do is set the Wayback Machine dial back to the 1980s and 1990s to see what the outcomes are from the notion, what outcomes flow organically from the notion that criminals, if it's not in their genes going back to West Africa, that trauma of one sort or another by way of slavery, Jim Crow, expansion of AFDC, crack, whatever, has now created a subspecies of poor people, speciation, right? I mean, that was the Moynihan line, who are unfixable, right? I mean, and if they are unfixable, as I believe Hillary Clinton said something to the effect in the mid-1990s, this is a kind of moral panic that the crack babies and super predators were illustrative of. She said something to the effect that we can debate, the origins of this problem, but the urgency of now necessitates that we act with tough on crime policies. So again, I just can't imagine anything but an illiberal outcome, if you will, from anything but a draconian outcome from biodeterminism. And Sanjay Gupta, interestingly enough, was a fun window onto that for me.
Great. Well, I don't watch CNN, so I'll have to check that out.
See, I'm more self-loathing than you. That's the issue.
So Aileen had, I'm not sure it was a specific question, but kind of an observation that puts Touré's comments today into a broader context. She mentions that he's not alone in raising some questions about racial reductionism. And she mentioned specifically Black British intellectuals. Paul Gilroy is one. And another, I'm familiar with Gilroy, and maybe other people are as well, but another name here I'm not, and this actually refers to maybe a kind of critique of reductionism with regard to the Irish. This author's name is Malcolm Chapman, and the book is The Celts, The Construction of a Myth. And she says it's a brilliant deconstruction project. But she also observes that at the end of that, Chapman, is still stuck with some of the parts of this this mythology. I think there might be one more question here.
Now, I sidestepped one question, sort of, where I focused, I think, Jim, you'd asked about challenging racism, and I instead focused on challenging racial inequality. And so I don't know if you wanted to, if that was worth entertaining or not. But
if it's okay with you, I'll hold off on the racism part of it. The idea of adjusting the terminology a little bit to racial inequality is something that I'm very comfortable with, and I think it's consistent with a couple of the things that we talked about earlier. If it's okay, there's what might be thought of as a kind of racial reductionism with regard to what people have been calling whiteness, and maybe I could insert that here in the interest of, for one thing, dragging the Irish back in a bit, and also maybe opening this a little bit to the audience. And it goes all the way back to Kevin Kenny's talk at the beginning. This was on the first of our Fridays in the morning, where he sort of kicked things off. And it also might have to do with the kind of terminology that we started with at the beginning. But in this case now, again, with regard to what people have come to call whiteness. So first of all, he stressed the differences between the situation of African Americans and Irish. And I should be careful, because Kevin would want me to be, that he's talking about the 19th century here. So we've been talking a lot about contemporary politics around race and class. He's talking about the famine Irish coming into the American city. And he stresses the difference between the two, and the idea that the Irish, upon arrival, had all kinds of advantages regarding citizenship and voting and so forth that the African American population did not have. That's fine. As far as I'm concerned, that's all granted. I get the contrast that he's making. Quote, white on arrival. I think that, ironically, that sort of indulges a kind of essentialism that's maybe been a problem in the scholarship on whiteness, maybe back from the beginning. And I think it greatly oversimplifies the situation of the Irish. I think it's one thing to say that they were in a much better position than African Americans were sort of in that 19th century period. It's another thing, I think, to say that in this, fairly well-defined racial hierarchy in the 19th century, that they were in any sense thought about as being equal to the native-born Protestant population. And one of the reasons, I'll stop talking in a minute, but I did want to emphasize why I thought this might be important. And that is that the Irish occupy, I think, a very important position in terms of race relations in the United States, if only by default. In other words, there's a well-documented conflict between the two groups. And as I've tried to show in some of the work that I've done, I think the Irish were also important in reproducing ideas about racism, in reproducing the language of racism and repertoires of behavior and so forth. Some of it is simple. It has to do with when they arrived in relation to later immigrants who, I would argue, learned the conventional wisdom about race that we have in the United States. And some of it is more complicated than that, having to do with attitudes among the Irish. What's pretty clear, unless the audience is invited to contradict me here, but in my sort of reading of the situation, there's little of that being, sort of notions of white supremacy, notions of racism with regard to African Americans, people from African descent in Ireland. And that instead, that seems to be a product of life in the American city, and not coincidentally seems, as far as I'm concerned, to have a lot to do with what Touré has been talking about, which is the meeting of these groups within a sort of distinct kind of class setting, and the way capitalism worked with regard to not just African Americans, but immigrants coming into the system. So I wanted to invite Touré, if he'd like, to comment a little bit on this, but I also want to see if anybody else wants to get in on this. I've been pretty careful in terms of the way I employ the arguments about whiteness, what's come to be called whiteness. I've been more interested in racism and the reproduction of racism across generations, especially with regard to immigrant people, than I've been in identity, quote unquote. I I think that notions of white identity and arguments about them are maybe a little less useful than looking at how racism has actually worked in a society and how it's survived for so long. So I'll stop there.
Well, I mean, I'll weigh in part with a question, but also to echo your sentiments. I've long been skittish about discussing race in terms of identity, partly because doing so takes what is an ascriptive or assigned category and treats it as if it's an internal category. And I think often enough, by that linguistic choice, one sets oneself up for not just essentialist accounts, that treat race as a social construct in name only, and that's important. But it creates some analytical problems, which I think are consistent with what you're getting at, Jim, insofar as if one decides that there is a white perspective on things, let's say, or a Black perspective on things, then in order to make sense of those Black people who step out of that box, or those white people who step out of the white box, then one has to otherize the members of that group, right? I mean, one has to say, as some do, to describe whites who, let's say, didn't vote for President Trump as race traitors, and those who did as, following through on their white sensibilities, which is a weird thing, right? I mean, just on that level, to suggest that, if I remember correctly, and I might be wrong about this, but in 2016, while President Trump carried the white woman vote, so that's a problem by itself as a formulation. The numbers, I believe, were revised down. I think originally Trump had allegedly carried about 53% of the white woman vote, but I think it was revised down to 48. So it was about a 46% split among white women, as I recall it. And so it's an almost even split among white women in 2016, Trump versus Hillary. I don't know how one could say in that situation that, that there was a white woman issue, right? A singular white woman issue. But if you insist that these are identities, at least that race is an identity rather than an ascriptive category, then you have to have escape hatches like race traitors or sellouts, which I know some scholars are actually attached to. The question, I guess, that I had for you, Jim, with respect to the mix of disadvantage and advantage that Irish immigrants had vis-a-vis Blacks, is I've thought, and I've long considered, one of the major factors in shaping Irish immigrants' experience in the 19th century was Jacksonian democracy. As I recall it, anyway, Republican newspapers on the lead up to the Civil War tended to disparage Irish immigrants, at least in Chicago, and while simultaneously, oddly, holding Black Americans in higher esteem vis-a-vis, Irish Americans, as I recall it. But the fact that Irish immigrants become an element within the pro-slavery Democratic Party, albeit in the northern branch of it, would have had a function as both an advantage for them, because they would have had a political party before emancipation that was working to one degree or another on their behalf, and of course would have informed, in keeping with your observation about racism among Irish Americans, which is distinct, anti-Black racism among Irish Americans in the 19th century, which was distinct from Irish nationals, would have informed that attachment to the Democratic Party in the antebellum period, would have informed their racial sensibilities, right? Along with the fact that they themselves faced disadvantage on something on the spectrum of what, and I thought Noel Ignatiev's line about this was fairly compelling, but something not unreasonably understood as racial discrimination.
So this question and your response to it have produced a wave of comments and questions. So no, some of them quite consistent with what you've been saying. There's a follow-up on mass incarceration. There's somebody who observes, which I'm quite sure is true, that in contemporary Ireland, I wanted to stress again that I was talking about the 19th century. Right. These historians are very peculiar about wanting to pin things down chronologically. So what I was saying about the Irish in the city and these questions that Touré just raised have to do with the 19th century city, not so much with contemporary Ireland or the United States. But there's a good question here. I think it came from Mel Allen via Miriam. And the question is simply, where do we find Irish Americans who do not think they're white? And contemporary Irish Americans. I could talk a little bit, if people want, or Touré might be able to, about in American history, where you find some Irish Americans like that. But today, are we finding race traders in the Irish American population today? I guess would be one way of putting the question.
Jim, would you pose that question again? Because your Wi-Fi snagged a bit, I think, as you were posing it.
Sure. It's an interesting question. And it was put kind of simply, and yet I think it's going to wind up to be a little complicated. The question was, where do we find Irish Americans who do not think they're white? And I'm happy to go on at length, but I think it might be a good idea for us to see if we can bring people in on that question. Let me stick one more in here, which might help. This is from Robert Snyder. Dennis Clark once wrote that Irish and Black Philadelphians of the 19th century met under circumstances that did not bring out the best in people, and that both Irish and Black Philadelphians were scarred and seared by their urban experience. One little piece of this is competition in the labor market, which feeds quite directly, I would say, into what Touré has had to say, but there are other elements of that as well. Competition for urban space. Somebody in one of the questions mentioned Irish gangs. They're particularly important in that regard. In other words, a territorial kind of thinking about the city, but probably in other ways as well. And again, people, I'm afraid, will have to bear with me. A couple of these questions are very, very long, and it's a good thing that they are pouring in now. And we have a response to that question, Miriam, about where do we find Irish Americans who do not consider themselves white? And I'll leave this, the person who makes this observation, anonymous for the moment. But she says, I don't think I'm white. And that seems to come from an Irish person.
That made me laugh
when
I read it.
Yeah. Here's another one. William Nevins is looming large in this discussion. Black Irish Americans and Chicano Irish Americans may not think of themselves as white, precisely. Tom Hayden, in his book, refuted the concept that being Irish made one white. Let's see if there's anybody else here. No one else wants to take up that question of where we find Irish people who do not consider themselves white?
Well, if anyone wants to delve into the archives of Irish America in a while, they'll be able to listen to our Black, Brown and Green voices, but that's that's a concerted effort to gather together, you know, those voices. I do think, you know, like I'm out of my depth here in terms of the theoretical, and sorry, I was called away a little bit with my 4-year-old wanting pizza. But you know, the context of Ireland versus Irish America, you know, I think it's very interesting and important, and part of the genesis of this conference is a transnational dialogue. Too often in Ireland, it's, you know, racism and Irish American racism is an American problem and we don't have it here. And that's clearly not the case. But it's also very important, I think, as a historian of the history of Ireland and migration of people from Ireland, that whiteness as a category historically for Irish people leaving Ireland was not a primary self-identifier. So that is not to say that racism did not exist or does not exist in Ireland, but that, you know, that sense of, you know, who the populations we're looking at and what it is about the Americanizing effect in that way that's throwing them in the 19th century, Jim, as you know, Kevin Kenny, all these people on the 19th century, throwing them in together. And, you know, obviously the Irish in time are advantaged by their whiteness, but it's not a primary identifier that they are. I remember when I first came to the United States in 2006, being horrified the first time someone referred to me as white. I'd never, ever thought of myself in that kind of way, right? The Ireland I had grown up in, you were either Catholic or Protestant. That was the primary identifier of you know, self-identity. And historically then the county identities, the subnational identities had been so important with these Irish immigrants. So sorry, I just wanted to chime in on that, because
No, it's great.
I love the layering and the disentangling of the identities that we need to do. But I think, you know, Kim and I think are on the same page in that on both sides of the Atlantic, we need to educate in opposite directions. And frankly, most of the people on this call don't need that kind of education or whatever. But the dialogue is really rich and important. And thank you all for contributing to that.
Just one quick observation directly on what Miriam just had to say. One is that this is a general problem in terms of historical problem, in terms of the history of immigration to the United States. In other words, well, not just the Irish, but all different sorts of immigrant people who came to the US might have had their own prejudices brought from the old world. Anti-Semitism is a good example. Prejudice against the travelers in Ireland might be another example that does go back. And so people were quite capable of having those sort of prejudices. In terms of learning the conventions of race in the United States, yeah, I don't think most immigrant people came with that. And the final observation I would make with regard to what you had to say just now, Miriam, is that that's encouraging. That's a kind of an optimistic way of looking at it, because what it means is that racism, as we experience it in the United States, is a learned value. It's a learned set of ideas. It's a learned set of values, even language. And it's not natural in that sense at all. And that probably, he can speak for himself, but that probably goes back to Touré's comments about essentialism. Alas, you know, this is not a natural process at all. It has to be reinforced over and over again and learned, and it has a lot to do with power in the United States. We've got a couple of more.
Well, I'm sorry, Jim, I'm being a terrible timekeeper here.
It's okay.
Sorry, I've kind of got caught up and excited and enjoying this and whatever. We actually unfortunately have to call it to a halt. Kim just reminded me that we've gone over. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Touré, for coming and engaging with us on this. That I can't wait to watch it back and be able to concentrate in full. This is a wonderful another angle that we've brought into the conversation today and over the past 3 weeks. And we're immensely grateful for your willingness Jim, for you to come back and revisit conversations you've been engaged in for a long time, and for us, Touré, to try and snag you into that Irish corner in terms of applying your wonderful rigor and scholarship and learning to some of the themes that we're interested in. I know by Kim's face she's really delighted with how it went, and thank you so much. We'll finish the Zoom call now and take a quick break, and our final, well, it's not our final, it's our penultimate session. Jim Carroll is going to be he's going to talk to us about the politics of white supremacy, a view from Irish Boston, moderated by Professor Kendra Field from Tufts University. Don't get panicked, and we're going to shut down this Zoom and restart again and come back on. And thank you again, Touré and Jim, on behalf of myself. Kim, do you want to come in there real quick?
Thank you so much. That's all I'll say. It was wonderful. I really appreciate your work.
Well, thank you so much for having me. You guys were awesome and so kind, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all.
Thanks, Touré.
Thank you, Jim.
Thanks to everyone. Thanks.